Welcome to this session on the Code of Ethical Standards. My name is Cormac Nagle. I'm a Franciscan friar and a priest, and I teach moral theology and I'm also a clinical ethicist. My task this afternoon is to look at the Code of Ethical Standards, explain what a code is, and then, having done that, look at how we might interpret the code. And to do that, I'll give a little history of the code and then go on to explain how we interpret standards, and look more specifically at the Catholic approach, how Catholic ethics differs from secular ethics, and then look at the sources. Where do we get these standards from? So, first of all, a code. What's a code? We know about the code, the road codes. We know about the criminal codes. And here we have a code of ethical standards. Well, a code is really a distillation of common sense, of wisdom, of practice and philosophies to save us in reinventing the wheel every time we get to an ethical problem. The Code of Ethical Standards has a little history. For many years, each Catholic health institution had its own particular code of ethics, and in the Mercy Hospital we had one which we revived in 1993, and then it was decided that it would be much better for our institutions if we had a universal code, a code for all the Catholic institutions in Australia. And so Catholic Health Australia then, which is the author of this code, with the help of a number of theologians and ethicists, put together this Code of Ethical Standards. The code itself makes it very clear in the beginning that this is not a book of rules. It has an introductory section telling us what the principles are, and then it goes on to describe how we put these principles in practice in specific cases. But again, the code makes it clear that we're looking rather to set up an ethical mentality rather than to have a book of rules. A book of rules is not really going to solve all our problems. When we're talking about a code and a code of laws, we need to remember that no code of laws can cover every human situation. And in the Code of Canon Law, which is the code for the Universal Church, the very last number of the Code of Canon Law cautions us and says, we must always observe canonical equity, balancer, and keep in mind that the supreme law of the Church is not law. The supreme law of the Church is the salvation of souls. And St. Paul emphasises that particular point in dealing with the Galatians, a group who wanted to observe the Jewish law. And he told them, really, what we're on about here is faith, and faith working through love. I'd like to give you a practical example of how we can be very legalistic. It was given to me the other day. Some of the paediatricians wanted to send babies up to the nursery, to the ordinary nursery, out of the special care nursery. And now in the ordinary nursery, the norm is there must be 34 weeks plus 6, 34 plus 6 days old. The person in charge of that ward will not accept a baby that is 34 and 4 days old. And the paediatricians are saying, but look, we've got these babies in special care nursery, they're perfectly healthy now, everything has been done for them, they're breathing, they're eating and everything else, they're ready to go. We need the beds in special care and neonatal care nurseries, but we can't get them upstairs because the rule up there is 34.6 and won't be changed. So it's an example, I think, of using of legalism, really, and not seeing as the Code of Ethical Standards says we must not consider this code as a book of laws, but as standards. Codes and doctrines and teachings are really formed in a particular historical situation. They're formed in a particular culture also, with a particular language. Now, all those aspects influence the writing of a particular code. And so to understand the code, then we need to be very much aware that there are these rules and regulations are set in a culture, set in a particular language, and have been made to control or to help a particular situation. For example, just recently, a cyclist was killed in Sydney Road here in Melbourne. Somebody opened the car door and he ran straight into it and got knocked down by a truck. And so the people who make the road rules, their code, decided that we'd better do something about this, so they changed the speed limit in Sydney Road, Melbourne, back to 40 kilometres an hour. It's just an example of how a particular norm arises. Catholic standards differ perhaps from the secular philosophies and secular standards. I suppose the main secular standard is a utilitarian one, what is good for most of the people most of the time. A Catholic or a Christian approach, and there are many different approaches, a Christian approach and a religious approach will function from the nature of that particular religious group, be it Muslim or Jewish or Catholic or Christian Protestant or Anglican or whatever. And the Christian approach in particular will be based on the fact that we human beings are created in the image of God, are loved by God, and our lives are very special. We have a great dignity. Now, if we want some detail, what does this mean, the dignity of the person? Just some very practical aspects. For example, if the human person is created in the image of God and has a great dignity, then we should have a consistent ethic of life from conception to natural death. We shouldn't be treating some people more equally than others. We're talking about the dignity of the person. We're not restricted simply to the direct medical or hospital situation. We're concerned with all those people who come under our care, whether it be in aged care or in home care, whatever. It applies to our relationship with everybody who comes under our care as a Catholic health institution. Put it this way, when I meet somebody, I am immediately in an ethical situation with that person. How I relate to that person, how I accept that person, how I look at that person, how I treat that person, so that when we talk about ethics, it's not just the clinicians and the nurses and the patients we're talking about everybody in our institutions, because everybody in the institutions, even amongst them, staff amongst themselves, are in an ethical situation in the way that they approach and treat the other person. That's basically the teaching of Christ, really, that we shall love our neighbour as ourselves. Today, many of the medical journals emphasise that person-centred medicine rather than medical-centred or doctor-centred medicine. And so another very practical point for us to recognise the dignity of a person or accept the dignity is to listen to the person, to gain the facts, to listen to the person. And also sort of corollary to that, allow or encourage the person, the patient, to speak. Then I think that we have to be very much aware that the patient, the person in our care, has fears and has hopes, and we need to let them tell us what their fears are, what their hopes are. And again, there is an unequal relationship. Anybody who goes to hospital, I think, knows that. There's an unequal relationship between the patient and the carer. So if we are really concerned about the dignity of the person before us, we'll be aware of that unequal relationship and try to level it, to make it much more equal. Another very practical aspect in which we can recognise and be aware of the dignity of the human person is to be very much aware that people fear the loss of privacy and autonomy. And I think if we're aware of that, it'll help us to treat the person in a much more dignified and human way, not just as a patient, but as someone who's created in the image of God and loved by God. If we move on then to look at the specific type of Catholic approach, we find that the Catholic approach is based on a natural law theory. And our natural law is a very old concept, and in the beginning, around the time of Christ, under the Stoics, the natural law, what meant this, what is good, what fits in with the human physical person is good, what is contrary to the human physical person is bad. However, our Catholic approach to the natural law says, really, what is good for the human person integrally considered. That is, the human person as a psychological being, a social being, a spiritual being, and so on. So it's a much broader concept, our natural law theory. Where do we get our standards from? We can list many sources, but three in particular are important, very important, I think. The first is the Bible, the Scriptures. The second is the teaching of the Church, the tradition of the Church down the ages, based on philosophy, certainly new and old, but also on the interpretation of the Scriptures and the application of the Scriptures to a particular situation. And thirdly, also most importantly, the third source is the human person as such, the human person integrally considered. So let's have a look at those three sources. The first one is the Bible. We have to be very careful in interpreting the Bible. We don't want a fundamentalist, literalist approach to the Bible. The Bible wasn't written that way. The Bible is really the history of God's people down the ages, their relationship with the people of God, those who believe in God, their relationship with God. And it's built on human history, and of course there are many aspects to human history. There are many norms given to us in the Bible, particularly in the Old Testament, and we know from the New Testament Jesus was very, very careful about these norms that the people of the Old Testament and the Pharisees and the legalists, the lawyers of the time, wanted to interpret things very literally. And just to give you an example of some of the laws of the Old Testament which we don't use today, which it's very obviously we don't use them because they don't apply to us, belong to a particular culture. And I just look at the book of Leviticus and chapter 11, and just a little verse or two from there. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron. Now Moses was the lawgiver and the leader. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Say to the people of Israel, these are the living things which you may eat among all the beasts that are on the earth. whatever parts the hoof, and is cloven hoofed, and chews the cud among the animals you may eat. Nevertheless, among those that chew the cud or part the hoof, you shall not eat these. The camel, because it chews the cud but does not part the hoof, is unclean to you. And the swine, because it parts the hoof and is cloven-footed but does not chew the cud, it is unclean to you. Of their flesh you shall not eat, and of their carcasses you shall not touch, for they are unclean to you. It's just a little example of some of the many laws and norms and regulations that are given in the book of Leviticus and the book of Numbers in the Old Testament, and we obviously consider we don't have to observe. That applies also to the second source, the tradition, the teaching of the church. Again, that's the teaching of the church teachings are set in a particular historical situation for a particular reason at the time, in a particular culture and in a particular language. And all those aspects are very important in interpreting church teaching. Again, we need not to be fundamentalist. Our third source of our teaching, say our standards, our ethical standards, will be the human person. And I'd like to make the point here that the human person is really a revelation from God, just as much as the scriptures are a revelation from God. So we look at the human person, integrally considered, and see what God has revealed to us in the human person. I can only touch on three little aspects. One of them, of course, is that we are sexual beings. Sexuality affects us in very many ways, emotionally, intellectually, and particularly in our relationships with ourselves, our relationships with others. And so as the Code of Ethical Standards goes on in some detail later on, it will try and apply that particular understanding of the human person as a secular person. Another aspect of the human person is that we have a conscience. It shows us the dignity with which God accepts us. We have a conscience, and in the teachings of the Church then, it's very clear, particularly after Vatican II, it's very clear that conscience is to be taken very seriously in the Church and in our understanding of the human person as a revelation from God. This particular quote is from Vatican II. Conscience is the most secret core and sanctuary of the person. There we are alone with God, whose voice echoes in our depths. And another one from Vatican II, the Declaration on Human Freedom. It follows that a person may not be forced to act in a manner contrary to conscience. Of course, it presupposes we've done a little bit of work to form our conscience. The third aspect of the person is we are mortal. We're going to die, we know that, and we will suffer also. We need to take that into consideration in our clinical approach and our to ethical standards. Suffering is a big question. I can't go into that much here, but what I'd like to say from my own experience is that if we didn't have to suffer, we probably wouldn't treat other people very well. Those are the basic sources, and what I've tried to do here is to tell you what a code is, what the Code of Ethical Standards is, and how to interpret it. Our teaching is specifically Catholic on the dignity of the human person, and to look at our sources, our basic sources for this teaching, the Bible, the Scriptures, the teaching of the Church, and the human person integrally considered. Thank you.